And I think it maybe helps us to see how we're viewing other people when that right to life is enshrined in law. That even if I do think you're an inconvenience, even if I do think that you're a burden, even if I am very angry at you, that doesn't take away that right. And the law helps me to recognise that.
Exactly. And when, going back to that sense of authority, if we have a law that we have at the moment that abortion's okay, if this doesn't impact you on a personal level, you might just go on with your life and just think, well, this is absolutely fine because it's the law. But until we start questioning it, like you said, like we did with slavery, that's when we begin to think, okay, this really needs to be human rights for all humans.
Hello and welcome to this podcast with Rachel Mackenzie. We're here again to look at abortion, and this time we're going to be looking at abortion and the law. Now, as we record this session, we're just coming up to April the 27th, where we remember the abortion law was implemented on this date in 1968, having been passed the previous year in October the 27th, 1967. So we thought it would be a good time to look at the law and how it affects our perception of abortion, how it affects the reality of abortion. And as I say, here to discuss that with me is the lovely Rachel Mackenzie. So thank you, Rachel, for joining us again.
Always a pleasure.
So it's quite appropriate, really, that we should be talking about this because our theme for this year for March for Life is human rights for all humans. And as with every other right, this right needs to be enshrined in the law. And now, I know generally our right to life is enshrined in the law. And this is something that applies to people of all different ages. Sometimes we might just think, well, my right to life is recognisable. Everyone can see, that I'm a human being. And so, in a way, why does it need to be enshrined in the law? But I think if we, don't have to look too far before we can realise there are situations maybe where people would get angry, or people might find somebody an inconvenience, somebody might be a burden to them, and it's very easy in those moments to maybe not fully recognise the other person's rights. And primarily, of course, we're talking about that very important right, the right to life. So just as my right to life needs to be enshrined in the law, or an older person who might be, at risk of being, thought of as a burden, maybe people who aren't as able to contribute in such obvious ways to society. They're often maybe sidelined and not, their full human rights aren't recognised. And I thought maybe it's just good to have a look at, how does that, reach the unborn then? And any maybe initial thoughts on that from you?
I think it's so important, and I'm so glad this year it's human rights for all humans, that this part of the law really needs to be looked at, because if we haven't got the right to life from moment of conception, then only any other right really just fades into insignificance. It's not important anymore. And I know there's so many, like Rachel's Vineyard is a charity, and there's so many really great charities out there, and we should be thinking about the homeless and addiction and all different groups that really need our support. But if we don't look at the right to life for the unborn, no other meaning do we have to any other organisation or support for anybody else.
And how do you think it maybe affects our perception of things then when we see something enshrined in law as a right? That affects how we look at things, doesn't it?
Without a doubt. We look at the law and it seems to have like a sense of authority. And especially I always think if you don't have any faith, that maybe you look at the commandments or, what would God do in this situation? What's he calling for me? That we would look maybe at the law and think, well, this is where my authority comes from.
Yeah, and I think if we look back in history, we can see that, for instance, with things like slavery. In the past, slavery was legalised, and so many people just went about with their lives not even thinking that there might be a problem with it. But once that law had put its stamp on it, it helps us to kind of think, oh, well, maybe there is a problem then. Maybe we can't just treat human beings as possessions, and that would even be the case for people who had slaves who they might treat well. They would maybe think that there is something deeper that's wrong with what I'm doing here, And I think it maybe helps us to see how we're viewing other people when that right to life is enshrined in law. That even if I do think you're an inconvenience, even if I do think that you're a burden, even if I am very angry at you, that doesn't take away that right. And the law helps me to recognise that.
Exactly. And when, going back to that sense of authority, if we have a law that we have at the moment that abortion's okay, if this doesn't impact you on a personal level, you might just go on with your life and just think, well, this is absolutely fine because it's the law. But until we start questioning it, like you said, like we did with slavery, that's when we begin to think, okay, this really needs to be human rights for all humans.
And I know we obviously start off by looking at the Abortion Act itself, but we see other laws that also impact particularly the preborn child and that issue of abortion. So I'm thinking, as we record this, buffer zones have very much been in the news again. And we saw just, not long ago with Livia Tisici-Bolt, now a convicted criminal simply for holding a poster saying, "Here to talk if you want," near an abortion centre. And with stories like this, I like to sort of maybe look on social media, see the comments that are coming in from, maybe just the general public and how people are perceiving this. And it's been interesting to see on some occasions how, you'll see people commenting saying, this is outrageous, this poor woman, just holding a sign saying, "Here to talk if you want," and now she's a criminal. And then someone will put a comment and say something like, but it's illegal to do that. Now, they're obviously misunderstanding the law because I would say it's actually been a miscarriage of justice what's happened to Livia. The law states that you can't show approval or disapproval near an abortion centre, which Livia wasn't attempting to do either. She was simply saying nothing more than her sign said, "I'm here to talk if you want." Yeah. But it's almost like they think, well, if the law is saying that, then that's fine. Rather than saying, well, if that was the case and the law was saying that it's criminal to do that, then what an egregious law, and we should be speaking out and saying how bad the law is. And you just see from looking at those comments how people do get their authority, their sense of right and wrong, simply from what the law says, rather than anything deeper.
And they actually start believing other people and their comments, well, she's gone against the law, then that's okay then. Instead of actually, well, let me have a look at the law, let me see what it says. Even like, we're both part of 40 Days campaign, and we are allowed outside of the buffer area to stand where we're standing, but the amount of not only passerbys that say you're not allowed to be here, but some 40 Day volunteers thought, are we still allowed to be here? Because they don't know the law as it stands.
Yeah, and I think that does remind us the importance of understanding the law. And I'm just wondering from your own personal situation, Rachel, because I know you've, shared many times about, your previous abortions.
Yeah.
Did the law impact you at all when you were making those decisions, or was it not a factor? What are your thoughts on that?
I never really gave it any thought until I remember years ago you asked me, what would it have taken for you not to have had an abortion? And it's like the light came on, and I thought, if it was against the law, because I feel like I am somebody that keeps the law, I would not have done it. So for me, that was really important that there was a law, not just to protect me, but to protect all humans. And at Rachel's Vineyard, the amount of women that say to me, I thought because it was legal, it was going to be okay, that it was going to be safe.
Right.
And yet I've never felt so, the complete opposite of empowerment, the complete opposite of safe. And that actually this law enabled them to not only, break and part of, their child to die, but part of them died that day. So it is the only law, as far as I can see, where somebody dies and somebody's left very wounded after a law that was meant to keep us all safe.
Yeah, and I think that reminds us that law, particularly when we're talking about the Abortion Act and laws to do with abortion, it's not just about protecting the preborn child, it's actually protecting the women as well, isn't it then? And we need that law to help protect them. And I know sometimes particularly you get sort of strong feminists like, women don't need protecting. We all need that protection at some point. There's been times, I'm sure, that most of us would admit when we've thought about doing something, whether it's just like going 5 miles over the speed limit, whatever it might be, little things that we might do, and it's the law that keeps us in check. Yeah. And certainly those moments when women are under extreme pressure in some situations, whatever might be going on in their life, pressure from other people, from their circumstance, you need that law to help you stay on the right track and keep within those boundaries of what will and won't harm you.
And yet in the abortion facilities and the women that have been to those, what I've seen is that they're not protected. Their own human rights, let alone their child, is not protected. And this isn't just a one-off. I remember I'll give a few examples. There was a woman that turned up visibly shaking, black and blue. It was quite obvious that this woman had been through quite a horrific trauma, and they thought the best we can do is abort her child. It was quite obvious that she needed support and help, that she was being not even coerced, forced into this abortion. Hayley that talks about her abortion experience when just before she's going to be put to sleep and the abortionist or the nurse said, you're going to be okay, and she said, I'm never going to be okay again. Wasn't that a red flag? Wouldn't that make you think, actually, I don't think we're protecting this woman here? Mm-hmm. And I know Hayley and many others, when they woke up from the anaesthetic, I hear this time and time again. I heard somebody screaming and realised it was me. Or, everybody else was screaming and crying. What law enables women to be screaming and crying after what so-called health procedure?
Mm-hmm. And it's not just about protecting women, is it? Because I think also men as well.
Yeah, what about the men?
I think often they can be quite disconnected from a pregnancy, even in a wanted and planned pregnancy, because it's not physically happening to them. Sometimes it's hard to make it kind of real. And I think having that law saying, yes, this is a human being who has a right which is enshrined in law, helps them to have the confidence to be able to speak up for that child if necessary and speak out about that child, because that right is enshrined properly legally.
Yeah. And when you think about the men, that the fathers of the unborn, they're not even allowed to come into the abortion centre. And again, it's sold as, this is to protect women. But, it takes, a woman and a man to have a child, and you're stripping away his rights as a human. His freedom of speech, of being able to be there for her, is all stripped down and taken away under the law.
And then medical professionals as well. They need that protection in law. I mean, we've certainly seen cases where freedom of conscience isn't any longer applied. Mary Dugan up in Scotland, Mary and Connie, the midwives up in Scotland. I know that was quite a few years ago, but even since then, we've had midwives who've really had to fight for their rights. We know, doctors have also sometimes talked about this, doctors and nurses, how there can be a pressure to get involved in abortion, even if it's just on the periphery and just getting the tips of their fingers dirty. That can become quite a pressure, can't it, once it's become enshrined in law?
Yeah, and I often think about, the abortion pill reversal that Dr. Dermot very bravely, supports women that have changed their mind, that have recognised, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And he was portrayed as somebody that was doing something illegal, and the abortion industry, got him in front of the General Council, Medical Council, and it was, he's doing something wrong. I mean, thank goodness that, it's proven that he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just using his own medical background to help people. But, and yet people would be thinking, well, how dare you, Dr. Dermot, help these women? Yeah. How ridiculous.
Yeah. And I think some of those points that we're making there, you can see parallels with the assisted suicide bill, can't you? Which, as we record, is still being discussed in Parliament. Yeah. With the concerns that are going on there. Doctors, medics may well end up being pressured to have to do things that they don't want to do, as well as just the general public. So we see the importance of making sure that all these people's rights are taken into consideration before something comes into law. Because we realise how many of them will end up being affected. It's not just that person who is either wanting to die in the case of assisted suicide, or just that preborn child, but all the rights surrounding it. And that's the problem with not recognising the right to life. We end up affecting everybody's rights once we start taking away different people's rights.
Absolutely. When we brought abortion in to be, not just legal and safe, but rare. And we've only used to look at Ireland, how it's gone from a few to many to hundreds to thousands. And, I remember this, I can't remember his name, this amazing speaker, he talked about the fact we're talking about euthanasia. We're not that we're going to go on a slippery slope, we're already on it. That we actually think that one life has more value than another. And we see the MPs debating this, and they've said, well, what about the elderly? What about, people with Down syndrome? That we don't need to safeguard any of that. Well, let's just look at Canada and look what Canada's done. And now they're at a stage in their own law of euthanasia, and this is exactly the same happened with abortion, where let's just start with this little law that keeps everybody safe. And now we're in Canada, where a woman, went to a hospital because she was so frightened for her own well-being because she has suicidal ideation. And what did they offer her? Euthanasia, assisted suicide. Like, a great speaker once said, this is just killing people. So if we're killing people there, we can't see that. That's what we couldn't see with abortion.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen the parallels to what you just described in abortion. I've seen women going to abortion centres saying, I really don't know what to do, thinking they're going to be counselled, and they're actually advised to have an abortion. And I know, like Natanya has bravely shared her story about this, of actually feeling quite pressured by abortion centre staff, let alone by other people who might have been pressuring her in her own situation. And I just want to bring up something that's just come into my head, Rachel. There was a book I read just a while ago, and I think this maybe kind of speaks into what we're talking about today. It was a book called Ordinary Men, and I actually encourage people to read it. It's a really interesting book, and it's actually looking at a group of, I think they were retired police officers during World War II, German police officers who were asked to help out with the problem as they saw it with the Jews. And they were asked to come to this, I think it was a city or a town in Poland, and they were asked to exterminate pretty much most of the town. So I think the working men were brought into the marketplace, the working aged men, and everyone else, men outside working age, women, children, babies, were to be exterminated. And now these were men who weren't convicted criminals. They'd never shot at anyone before or killed people. As I say, they were reserve police battalion. I think it was Police Battalion 101. And they weren't told to do this. They were asked if they would do this by their commanding officer. And I think one person said, no, I don't want to do this. And once he had said that, I think there was another about 10 that said, actually, we don't want to either. There was no reprisals. Okay, they don't have to do it. Everyone else agreed and went along and quite brutally killed that whole town and went on to kill other towns as well, exterminate other towns they were told to where Jews were living. And I think this really kind of maybe helps us see something of what human beings are capable of. That these were not people who had got, criminal records. They weren't people who'd done, crimes in the past. As I say, they're actually people who in the past had been enforcing good laws in the past. And suddenly they became killers. They became, people willing to do the most terrible things because they felt there was that sort of authority from the law. And I think there's some parallels. Obviously, we have to be careful about what parallels we draw, but there's certainly some there that I think are worth looking at. That because something became legal, and maybe there was a bit of peer pressure as well, which I'm sure, went into it. Their friends were doing it, so okay, maybe it must be okay if they're all doing it. And suddenly look at what they did at the drop of a hat, what they were all willing to do. I think it's maybe like a kind of bit of a reminder to us of what we can be capable of. We've all got that inside us, that capacity for doing something sometimes just a little bit silly, sometimes something really grave, because we think that the law has okayed it, and maybe because other people are doing it, you know.
Yeah. What we've got to do is, like, you know, the word, you know, exterminate is so near to terminate, but we've only need to just take away or dehumanise just some humans, like you're saying, you know, with the Jews, or when you think about Rwanda and what happened there, you know, just by on the radio, they started calling them locusts and snakes. So in the end, they didn't even think they were killing somebody that was human, you know. So, it's quite scary.
What about then, Rachel, you know, the consequences of, you know, I know sometimes people say, well, abortion's going to happen anyway. You know, if you did make abortion illegal, the consequence would just be that it would sort of go underground, you know, and it would happen. What would your thoughts be, particularly as somebody who talks to people who you know have had many abortions?
Well, so we're already at the back streets. When people go, we have to have it. It has to be the law, has to be safe, because we'll go back to the back streets. Well, that's where we are now. We're at the back streets with, you know, pills by post. That's exactly where we are, with no health care. But that's also like saying, well, you know, rape's still going to happen. Child abuse is still going to happen. So we might as well just make it, you know, legal that anyone can do whatever they want.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like you say, if we're talking about rape, for example, then, you know, you could think of some reasons why people might say, oh, well, if it was legal, then a man who was raping a woman wouldn't think, oh, I need to kill her afterwards because, you know, I don't need to cover up my crime. So if I let's just make it legalised, or maybe if it's legal, then we could give STD checks for rapists or whatever, you know. But, you know, that just the thought of it is just so farcical that it, you know nobody would agree with that, quite rightly so. And yet those same principles, like you say, are principles that are used to give validity to having an abortion law. Like you say, oh, it will go back to back streets. And yet we've got every street abortion, you know, with you know, abortions in people's own homes, where they're, you know, regulating it themselves. They're working out what date of pregnancy they're at. They're doing it in the isolation of their own bathroom or wherever it might be.
Who's being protected there?
Absolutely. And I think maybe just as a kind of final point, we do need to touch on the fact that a lot of people nowadays are talking about a need to decriminalise abortion. And you know, obviously we know what they're really pushing for is abortion up to birth. But what they'd be talking about when they say this is that, you know, do we want women criminalised for having an abortion? Is that really right? And so from that perspective, they would be saying, you know, abortion shouldn't be enshrined in law. It certainly shouldn't be criminal, because otherwise women who have abortions, you know, maybe, for example, outside the scope of the law, if they have an abortion over 24 weeks when they haven't been given explicit permission for certain reasons, you know, that is still criminal in this country if the child hasn't got a disability or Down syndrome or whatever. You know, those women being classed as criminals. And yet we see, don't we, with other laws where each individual situation is looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Exactly.
You know, so we would, for instance, if we had a mother who was suffering from postnatal depression and, you know, in a mad moment she smothered her newborn child, clearly that would be wrong. But as to how that mother was treated, you know, they would look at all sorts of things. They'd look at her mental state. They'd look at the pressures that she was under. You know, was she getting any support? Had she already tried to reach out for support and not received it? You know, all those kinds of things would be looked at before any kind of, certainly any punishment, let alone any sort of ramifications for what she'd done were considered. And I think that's what a lot of, you know, pro-life people would recognise would be needed in the law with regards to women who have abortions outside the scope of the law, even at the moment, that would need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, looking at, you know, those individual situations, but also recognising, you know, that little life that is taken away through abortion, and the justice that should be maybe looked at in regards to that life. Decrim is just dehumanising even more. It is. I think maybe then really what we need to kind of recognise from this is that just the ordinary man and woman in society, ordinary men and women in society, we do need laws to protect ourselves. Sometimes from ourselves, you know, even like with cases of suicide and things, we you know, to know that in law our life is valued is really helpful, and certainly when we're looking at other people. So in case we're tempted to ever think somebody is inconvenient, somebody is a burden, you know, somebody doesn't deserve to live, when we see that right enshrined in a law, we need that there, don't we, for ourselves and for that person.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel.
No problem.
It's really lovely to talk to you again today. And I want to encourage you all who are listening to this, wherever you're listening to this or watching this, please share this video, like and subscribe to our channels, and please make sure that you're keep yourselves up to date on all the information regarding abortion so that you can talk effectively about it to other people with truth and with compassion.